have joining us now Jonathan Meer from Texas A&M and Justin Wolfers from the University of Michigan. Welcome and thank you both for those talks.
Pleasure, mate.
Happy to be here.
Great. We got some good questions in the question box in the webinar. But first off, I just want to start with how have your students responded to these videos and new class formats that you guys have been, Jonathan, you've been doing it for a while. Justin, you're doing some new things this semester. How have students responded to this moment?
Go ahead, Justin. I'm going to let you go first.
Oh, the question was clearly, hey, look, I think it is important to talk a little about style. And John has so many good tips, and not only good tips, he also has great resources behind him. So, separate from the substance, you noticed actually the way that I was presenting there, which is I was present and my slides were present. This was very much a poor man's way of trying to jerry-rig what Jonathan Meer does with his Lightboard. If anyone wants to know more about how to do that, I'm happy to show you. But I can tell you I just got my first set of teaching ratings back. The students have lots of complaints that the material's too hard and that the professor's obnoxious. But they actually really appreciated seeing you there. And I think one of the important things that John talks about and that I internalized is you have to form an emotional relationship with your students. They're going to get more excited about you than they are about supply and demand, and making sure that you're there and you're present in a way that Zoom doesn't natively allow. It allows you to be a little thing in the corner, I think is really important. And so I think for each of us, there's a lot to take from Jonathan's way of doing this, but there are also tweaks that can deliver many of the same benefits.
I think it's to build on Justin's point. I think it's really difficult to make that connection looking into a black mirror, and you have to trust that your jokes are going to land, which they don't always. And having humanizing examples. I often poke fun at my colleague Steve Wiggins, with whom I co-teach the course, who's a fair bit older than I am, and so I make cracks about that. And the students get a kick out of it. He makes cracks about me, and they're limited because again, there's a limit to how much you can stuff into an 8 to 10 minute video. But that kind of humanizing stuff. For us, Texas A&M specific examples to have the students feel like it is more of a personalized feature. My colleague, again, is as sort of de rigueur for us, a huge college football fan. And so talking about whether Coach Jimbo Fisher's outsized contract makes sense in terms of his marginal value for Texas A&M revenues. What does it mean to sell out all of Kyle Field with its 105,000 seats? And so really, I know that's something that Justin and Betsy emphasize in their book and in their discussions about teaching, is having examples that are relatable. I don't like talking about widgets. And to that same point, the examples that I try to put together, for example, for externalities, rather than having the town and the factory, which is sort of the standard example, I talk about your roommate playing loud music. And so that's a natural segue into, well, who has property rights over the quiet of the room? What does it mean if the RA comes in and imposes a quiet hours solution? And also, why is it weird to talk about paying your roommate to not play music? And what is, when you have imperfect monitoring or imperfect compliance or imperfect knowledge of someone else's preferences, what would it mean to not be able to have that, more cozy and solution? So kind of admitting these are useful abstractions rather than real ways to live your life, I think, again, humanizes the subject for the students.
Yeah, and so as we both just saw in your presentations, you're doing interesting things. What are the first steps or kind of the gateway drug that an instructor could take if they're trying to get a little more creative with their lecture recording or their asynchronous class presentation?
I think the first thing is wanting to do it. And that's one of the important lessons I learned from John Meer, actually, because he's been doing this for thousands of students for several years. So we should be clear. I'm in a crash course learning how to do this post-COVID. He's been doing it for a long time. The second is I've been struck by how many of my colleagues I've said, look, there's all these exciting things we could do, and I've shown them Meer on the Lightboard, and I've shown them my solutions. I'm like, wow, I never thought of that. And it's because it's expensive, I don't want to do it. I think a reasonable way of thinking about this is In the old days, being a year ago, it wasn't unusual to spend several $100s on a suit, right? Literally a suit. That's how we present ourselves. I am not spending any money on a suit. The modern version of a suit, making sure that you present yourself in an appropriately professional way, is a high quality microphone. And so as soon as you do that, I am going to spend 1 or 2 suits up, lifting my game. All of a sudden you'll discover there are a lot of fairly low cost, high impact innovations that you can do.
I was blown away really by folks like Emily Nix and Dan Quint, who built their own for amounts that I found much lower, certainly than what we had built, and the outcome really looks amazing. And of course, not everyone is going to be capable of putting something like that together themselves. I don't know that I would be, but it certainly is doable, and maybe a weekend project for 3 or 4 faculty members who then stick it in a room and use it round robin. But really, I'd always thought this was something that took months of planning, and we had a large internal grant to do and staff handling it and stuff like that. So to me, it was always this: either you spend thousands of dollars ordering one from a company, or you have people whose job it is to figure this out. And seeing the folks who I mentioned do it was really mind-blowing.
We got a request for drop the link for that microphone into the chat, Justin. We can do that when we're done here. To teaching. So in a micro class, what model should we focus on? And how do we deal with the fuzziness of aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Do we start without the fuzziness and then bring in the fuzziness, or how should we approach that?
I mean, one answer is we're all currently in a very difficult world, and if you don't want to adjust how you teach your macro model to I will be the first person to understand. The second answer is, if you look at the long run of macroeconomic history, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model was developed in the 1960s as a purely pedagogic device. And it promised to be a useful way of teaching Keynesian economics, and it was going to live off a rough analogy between microeconomic demand and microeconomic supply. 2 things have happened. 3 things have happened. The economy has changed a lot. Our understanding of the macroeconomy has changed a lot, and the language that we use to describe it has changed a lot. And so the question is, can you teach in a way that feels authentic for you? I discovered that because most macroeconomists naturally speak in a language that's ISLM, or ISMP is the modern version of that. If you try and talk to any policymaker, they won't use those words, but that's pretty much the language they're using. That's the language that's authentic for me. And I found that when I had to go into the classroom and teach ADAS, which is incredibly awkward, I don't know if any of us can remember even why the AD curve is downward sloping. It felt inauthentic, and then I was doing a less good job. And so I'm simply of the view that if you were trained in the last 30 years, you're going to find it more authentic to teach a model that's more consistent with your training, and you'll probably do a better job, which is why I teach using ISMP.
I don't know anything about macro. It's been a good decade since I've thought about macro. I can say though that for micro, I really do think that it's so important to spend more time than we might think on the really basic principles that Justin was highlighting. Because marginal analysis and opportunity cost and thinking about costs and benefits systematically, it comes naturally to us because we've been doing it for so long. But it doesn't come naturally to the students, and we see that whenever you have those questions that go around that about opportunity cost that seems so obvious to us, and 20% of the students get it right on the exam. And then what I always tell my students is, we're really teaching you guys like 3 things, and then everything else is an application of that. So if you explain opportunity cost and then walk through why that means that supply looks the way it does, and then really just nail down the fundamentals and spend way more time on it than you would think, they'll walk away from the course understanding more economics. And it's much easier to then do things like taxes or talk about the labor market, because it doesn't feel like a new concept. It feels like this is the exact same thing, except we're calling it wages and employment instead of price and quantity. Or I understand why the supply curve moves this way when there's a tax where the statutory incidence is on producers. It's not magic. I don't have to memorize a list. And I just want to plug one concept, and feel free to steal this line because I stole it from a STAR student we had in the very first semester we taught the course, which was students like to work hard to not think, which is I don't actually, Justin, I'm not sure your book has this, but it very well might. There's that chart of why demand, when population increases, demand moves like this. When population decreases, demand moves like this. And students love studying by staring at that chart until they've memorized it. And what I always tell them is don't do that, because I'm going to give you a weird question that's not on that chart. But if you understand what a demand curve is, it's about willingness to pay. Well, at every quantity, are people willing to pay more or less for this amount? I can't throw you a curveball. And so always bringing it back to those basic concepts. So their inclination, it's probably what worked for them in high school. Their inclination is to work hard to not think, to sort of brute force memorize the concepts.
I just want to just double down and endorse everything that John said. I want to endorse it in two additional ways about the importance of getting that foundation right. The first is, if you ask most instructors what we're trying to do, we're trying to get our students to learn to think like an economist. Those are habits of thought. That's cost benefit, it's the marginal principle, it's the opportunity cost principle. It's not remembering the impact versus incidence formulae for tax incidence. And the second thing is just purely pragmatically, if the students haven't fully understood supply and demand by the time you move on, the rest of the semester is not only may as well be in another language, literally is in another language. And so if you lose 20% of your students, but you're losing them for 80% of the semester, that's a lot of loss right there. So just slow it up, bring everyone aboard, and then let's just move the train forward a little slower.
Yeah, but it's solid foundation to go further. So that felt like a very quick Q&A, but thank you both so much for joining us. Jonathan Meer of Texas A&M, Justin Wolfers of the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for your presentations and your time today.
John and Clay, great to talk to you.
Awesome.
Great being here. Thank you.